Hello, welcome back to Bioclass Bytes. In this video, we are going to talk about, from the perspective of DRRM, what to expect between the state and the citizens. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like and share this video. A huge portion of our discussion in this video will come from Republic Act 10121, the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010. Its full title, an act strengthening the Philippine DRRM system, providing for the national DRRM framework and institutionalizing the national DRRM plan, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes. You can actually access this from the official gazette.gov.ph. I'll provide the link in the description below. Here are some terminologies that hopefully will just be a recap for you as we have thoroughly discussed them in the previous videos and lectures. So, disaster response, this refers to the provision of emergency services and public assistance during or immediately after a disaster. Okay? So, disaster response is predominantly focused on immediate and short-term needs. Okay? So, also known as disaster relief. On the other hand, disaster risk reduction refers to the systematic effort to analyze and manage the causes of disasters, again by reducing vulnerabilities and, if you still remember, and exposure of the citizens and enhancing capacities in order to lessen the adverse impacts of hazards and the probability of disaster. So I hope now at this point these two are quite clear to you already. So disaster response, that's the action taken after the disaster. While disaster risk reduction, that's a more comprehensive way of avoiding disaster because you provide their mitigation, procedures, and adaptation strategies in order to reduce the vulnerability, reduce the exposure, and to strengthen the ability of the community to respond and recover from disasters. So why do we need to give importance again? This is just a review. Importance to disasters, specifically here in the Philippines. So we know that we are one of the most disaster-prone nations. We are along the Pacific Ring of Fire. We are found along that region that experiences a lot of disasters historically. So the exposure of the Philippines to disasters is attributed to its geographical and physical characteristics. Earthquakes are quite common. We are exposed to a lot of typhoon, a lot of storm surges, being an archipelago, and all that. Okay. So aside from natural causes, the Philippines also experiences human-induced or man-made disasters or man-made cause disasters. Okay, so these are brought about by political and social economic origins, ill-applied technologies, engineering hazards. We've all talked about this in that unit on natural hazards. So many of our citizens are forced to evacuate during times of conflict. It's people die from earthquakes because of the collapse of substandard buildings and all that. Okay, and then also note that the health of our people is severely affected um, because of industrial and domestic waste, pollution, and of course, climate change. So again, no, this one is just a recap. We've been studying this. I've been telling this since the first unit. Hazards are always there. There will always be earthquakes. The volcanoes will always be there. You cannot remove volcanoes. Um, Typhoons will always come. Climate change is there. So those hazards are always present. However, they only become disasters if we are not able to protect our people, if we are not able to reduce their vulnerability and exposure. Okay, and they are exposed to those hazards. And we've also noted this in the previous videos that people who live in poverty are most likely vulnerable to disasters. They do not have the capacity to resist. They have very low resilience and very low capabilities for recovery. So they are the ones who are most vulnerable. So this includes the poor, the sick, people with disabilities, elderly, women, and children. Okay. So, although many people could be affected, everyone could experience the same disaster, the same hazard. Those with high vulnerability, they have the least capacity to recover from the impact of that disaster. Okay, so that's why it's very important to strengthen the capacity of those vulnerable parts of our community, vulnerable regions, in order for them um, to cease being the victims of disasters. Okay, so if you still remember, you know, these are just some examples of um, recent um, disasters that we experienced: the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991, Typhoon Yolanda or Haiyan, the strongest typhoon that our country has experienced, and then this one, strongest earthquake since 2001, near Cotabato Trench, in the eastern cluster at the southern portion of the Philippine Trench. So our countrymen were exposed to those very strong earthquakes. This article is from the Palladium, the official student publication of the Ateneo Law School. So this article entitled DRRM Act, the Law in Times of Disasters, written by Lucido. So there the author said that preparation is very important, especially for the Philippines, a calamity-stricken archipelago. And one of those preparation is the in Philippine law is the Republic Act 10121, okay? The DRRM Act. And it is important for us to note that the 2010 DRRM Act is actually a repeal of the Presidential Decree number 1566. Okay, so this we already had the Presidential Decree in the past, but it was actually updated into the DRRM Act of 2010. So the first one, the Presidential Decree 1566 was actually under the administration of then President Ferdinand Marcos. Okay, so the president during that time established a disaster and calamities plan, and then in 1972 the Office of Civil Defense mandated to coordinate national level activities and functions of the national government in terms of responding to disaster. And finally, the presidential decree created the National Disaster Coordinating Council, okay, in 1978. So that was the highest policy-making body to address disaster management in the country. Um, so that was in 1978. In 2009, the Congress enacted the Climate Change Act of 2009 and Republic Act 10121. So that's the DRRM Act. So these are very important laws. These twin laws, first one on climate change and the other one on DRRM, are very important because they have the common goals to increase the resilience of vulnerable communities against disasters. Okay, so mostly climate change played a huge role for that. And then to reduce damage and loss of lives and properties due to disasters. So in 2009, these two laws, okay, Climate Change Act and DRRM Act, were passed in order to address the need for disaster response. And then we've talked about, of course, the importance of disaster risk management in our previous lessons. Okay. So these two laws acknowledges that there is a need to adopt a disaster risk reduction and management approach that is holistic, comprehensive, and integrated. Okay, so not anymore just disaster response, but disaster risk management. So this table shows us the difference between Presidential Decree 1566 and the DRRM Act of 2010. So the Presidential Decree 1566 from 1978 mostly focused on disaster response. So we've mentioned that a while ago, that these are the response or actions taken after the disaster. On the other hand, the DRRM Act focuses on disaster risk reduction. So this includes mitigation and adaptation strategies to lessen vulnerability and increase the resilience. Now, this comes into play after a disaster, while here, 2010 recognizes that disasters can be reduced by addressing the root cause of disaster. So here, PD 1566 centered only on the impacts of disaster. Here, mechanisms prior to the happening of the disaster. PD 56 assumes that disasters cannot be avoided, but the modern act says that um, we can actually avoid disasters through adaptation and mitigation procedures. And here, PD 56, most of the plans were the provision of relief. How do we help the people after they encounter the disaster? While here, the emphasis is on strengthening the people's capacity to absorb stress. It strengthens their capacity to endure the disasters and to totally avoid the disaster, okay? And also to bounce back better from the disaster, so recovery. And in PD 1566, the declaration of a state of calamity is needed in order to access the fund. Okay? While here, the declaration of state of calamity is no longer needed in order to access the fund. So this one, we already have this in 1978, but it was revised and repealed and become more modern and more comprehensive under the DRRM Act of 2010. Here is another diagram to show us the difference between the two laws. So PD 1566 is top-down, okay, and centralized disaster management. So everything comes from the national government, while the DRRM Act is bottom-up and participatory. So it means that it starts from the bottom, it starts from the community, okay, in coordination with the local government units, and then eventually overseen by the national government. PD 1566 also states that disasters are as see disasters as merely a function of physical hazards. Okay, so they see disasters as a result of those physical hazards, while DRRM states that disasters are mainly reflection of the people's vulnerability. So all hazards are there. They only become disasters if you're not able to protect the people and to lessen their vulnerability. And then PD 1566 focuses on disaster response, what happens after the disaster, while DRRM Act has a more integrated approach to genuine social and human development by reducing disaster risk through adaptation and mitigation strategies. This document is from the Commission on Audit, and this is the assessment of disaster risk reduction and management at the local level. So it's actually a report. So most of the things here we have already discussed in the past. So in terms of natural hazard settings in the Philippines, we are quite vulnerable to typhoons, cyclones, tropical cyclones, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. We are placed along the Pacific Ring of Fire. From 1970 to 2009, the annual average direct damage of disasters ranged from 5 billion to 15 billion pesos. Okay? So the cost of the direct damage is equivalent to 0.5% of the national gross domestic product within this period. Okay? Natural disasters also claim an annual average of 1,002 casualties, and in the last 5 years, flooding has been the topmost disaster in the country. You can access this report. I'll provide the link in the description below. Now, this table shows us the natural disaster occurrence in the Philippines from 1900 to 2014. So, most of those natural disasters are hydrometeorological in nature. So we have here flood and storm. Okay, and then others you have your volcano, volcanic eruption, earthquake. Okay, the number of events is 564, and the total number of people killed within this period is 69,724, and the number of people affected is 185,749,697, and the total economic damage in terms of US dollars is 22,971,533. Now, with the new DRRM Act, there's this paradigm shift again, no, from Presidential Decree 1566 into DRRM Act of 2010. So the shift is to move away from the focus on disaster relief, but mostly into disaster risk reduction management. So the goal is to look into adaptation and mitigation procedures and strategies and to lessen the vulnerability and exposure of the people to increase their recovery and chances of recovery and their resilience as well. So what is the Hyogyo Framework for Action? It's actually a key instrument for implementing disaster risk reduction adopted by the United Nations. Its overarching goal is to build resilience, again, of nations and communities to disasters by achieving substantive reduction of disaster loss by 2015. Okay, so the priorities for action in the Hyogyo Framework for Action includes to guide states, organizations, and other actors at all levels in designing their approach to disaster risk reduction. Now, in this document, the Secretary General of the United Nations during that time, Ban Ki-moon, um, states that climate change is expected to cause more severe and more frequent natural disasters. Okay, so we have a moral, social, and economic obligation to build resilience across all countries by 2015. So implementing the Hyogyo Framework for Action will help us reach the Millennium Development Goals. So to learn more and to find out what happened during the World Conference on Disaster Reduction in 2005, I recommend that you watch this video entitled Hyogyo Framework for Action. I'll provide the link in the description below. So again, the HFA, Hyogyo Framework for Action, was developed in 2004 following the tsunami, which claimed more than 200,000 lives. So this emphasized the need for a paradigm shift. Again, we've mentioned this in the previous videos, from disaster response to disaster risk reduction. Because before this time, all the efforts are done after the disaster has occurred already. But now they see the need to prevent it as much as possible. So the HFA was formulated by 2005, adopted by 168 governments in the World Conference on Disaster Reduction in Kobe, Japan, 2005. It is aimed at building the resilience of nations, reducing vulnerabilities, risk, and exposure to hazards. Then by 2009, the Philippine Senate ratified the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, which is the ASEAN's affirmation of its commitment to HFA. Okay. So these are the five major parts of the program of the HFA. So number one is to make disaster risk reduction a priority. So that was the shift from disaster response to disaster risk reduction. Know the risk and take action by identifying, assessing, and monitoring disaster risk in the country or community. Be prepared and ready to act to strengthen disaster preparedness, reduce the risk of underlying risk factors, and to, again, very important, build understanding and awareness by using knowledge, innovation, and education to build a culture of safety and resilience at all levels. According to DRRM Act 2010, in case of a disaster, who are involved and what is the depth of their involvement? So if you still remember, the 2010 law is actually a bottom-up and participatory in terms of its model for disaster risk reduction. So it always starts with the community. Okay, communities are both disaster victims and agents of change. So their active and substantive participation is very important since they are the ones most familiar with their situation. If you still remember, no, we talked about this in the previous unit in the previous series. And according to UN, if those exposed to hazards are unaware of the risk they face, it is difficult to see how or why households, businesses, or governments would invest in reducing their risk levels. So the community members, the citizens are the ones who are most knowledgeable with their situation, so they themselves shall determine which approach of disaster management is most appropriate for them. Then the next level would be the CSO, civil society organization, private sectors, and volunteers. So they complement and enhance the government's resources and efforts in implementing an effective disaster risk reduction management. So this includes cooperatives, organizations, private organizations, neighborhood associations, NGOs, church-based organizations, and even academic institutions. Then the next level would be the LGU, the local government units. They are the frontliners and the first responders in every disaster event. Okay, so they are the ones, so those are your mayors, city councilors, vice mayors, barangay officials. So they take the lead in preparing for or responding to and recovering from that disaster. And then overall, no, this all of these are monitored by the national government. So that includes the office of the president, vice president, senators, congressmen, and all that. So the different government departments and agencies are constituted as members of the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council and DRRMC to ensure the consistency in the implementation of DRRM policies. So, for example, right now we are in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So, aside from NDRRMC, we also have the IATF. So, that's another council created to at the level of the national government level with the inclusion of local government units that would help in this type of disaster. So these are the different groups that are involved as mandated by the DRRM Act of 2010. Again, in this report from Commission on Audit, government agencies are clustered under the different phases of disaster management, okay, in order to ensure a more effective response. So under mitigation, so that's to lessen, no, the effect of a disaster. So you have your DNR, DILG, DOF, Department of Finance, then DBM, Department of Budget and Management. For preparedness, you have your PIA, Philippine Information Agency, DepEd, PNRI, Nuclear Research Institute, Pag-asa, PhilBox, DOLE, and DOT, Department of Tourism. And then for response, you have your DepEd, AFP, Armed Forces of the Philippines, DPWH, and then DOH. And then for rehabilitation, DPWH, DOTC, Department of Transportation and Communications, then Department of Agriculture, DTI, NHA, National Housing Authority, and then DOH. Then the overall NDRRMC includes NEDA, DBM, DOF, Department of Finance, and DILG. So those clusters, for example, such as DNR, Department of Education, and DPWH, are lending support to Regional Disaster Coordinating Council to institutionalize the standards of the cluster approach. Okay, so LGUs still continue to play a critical role, but but capabilities at the local level and coordination between the latter and national government agencies still face a big challenge. So if you want to read more about this clustering, you can visit it. I'll provide a link in the description below. Again, so to better understand how the clustering applies to disaster planning, so these are the um, um, government agencies and then their major contribution in terms of disaster management. So the Department of Science and Technology, DOST, their goal is to avoid hazards and mitigate their potential impacts by reducing vulnerabilities and exposure and enhancing the capacities or resilience of the community. While the Department of Interior and Local Government, so DILG, their goal is to establish and strengthen capacities of communities to anticipate, cope, and recover from the negative impacts of disasters. DOST is more on disaster prevention and mitigation. DILG is under disaster preparedness. DSWD is for disaster response, so that's to provide life preservation and meet the basic needs of the affected population following a disaster. While NEDA, National Economic and Development Authority, is for rehabilitation and recovery. So that includes, their goals include restore and improve facilities, livelihood, and living conditions, reduce disaster risk in accordance with the Build Back Better principle. And we've talked about this building back better or disaster recovery in the previous unit. Now, this one is from the teaching guide for senior high school DRRM. So it just shows us the flow chart. Okay, so overall, in case of a disaster, so NDRRMC oversees the regional disaster risk reduction management councils. And then below that, so you have your provincial, which is broken down into city. Okay, if you live in a city, city disaster risk, then municipal disaster risk. And then under the city disaster risk, you have your barangay disaster risk reduction management. Okay, so the same for the cities and municipalities. Okay, so this one for the local government units. Okay, so these are your local DRRMC. How can DRRM initiatives be sustained by the Philippine government? So, under participation and capacity, this includes the inclusion of CSOs. Okay, so if you still remember, CSOs are civil society organizations, and private sectors in DRRM councils to monitor government performance. So that's how they check the performance of um, um, government officials. Formulation of a national institutional capability building program for DRRM. And then for funds, um, uh, the government is in charge of monitoring of releases, utilization, and accounting. Okay, accounting and auditing of the funds, okay, of the local DRRM funds in accordance with the guidelines and procedures. In terms of standards, this includes formulation of national standards in carrying out DRRM programs and formulation of standard operating procedures for all involved. For penalties, the government is also allowed to penalize public officers who are found guilty beyond reasonable doubt of committing prohibited acts, including dereliction of duties, okay, or negligence, no, which leads to the destruction, loss of lives, and critical damage, and even misuse of funds. And then for monitoring and evaluation, so this is cared of the National DRRM Council. Um, in terms of development and enforcement by agencies and organizations using various guidelines, codes, and laws required by the DRRM Act of 2010. So this one is actually a document from NDRRMC RMC. The topic of or the subject of this document is the revised guidelines for the declaration of a state of calamity. I'll provide the link to this document and you can find it in the description below. So according to this guideline, okay, this document, for national declaration, the President of the Philippines, upon the recommendation of NDRRMC, may declare a cluster of barangays, municipalities, cities, provinces, and regions under state of calamity, and also the ones who's capable of lifting that declaration. So once a region, a city, or a province is declared under the state of calamity, they could now accept international humanitarian assistance per recommendation of NDRRMC. So in terms of utilization of funds, areas under state of calamity, either by the president or concerned sanggunian and DRRMC, shall be able to utilize relief and recovery programs in order that situation and living conditions of the people are stricken by a disaster or calamity or epidemics. Okay, and so complex emergencies so that their lives may be normalized as quickly as possible. So how do we know what are the requirements in order for a city or province or region to be declared under state of calamity? So it says that if there's at least 15% of the affected population are in need of emergency assistance, or at least 30% have lost their livelihood in terms of agricultural, business, and industrial sectors. Okay, damage to critical and lifeline infrastructure, widespread destruction of fish ponds, poultry, and livestock, disruption of lifelines such as food supply chain, electricity, potable water system, and when there's an extremely high incidence of diseases, communicable or non-communicable, and lastly, significant degradation of environment and natural resources. So these are the criteria in order for the declaration of state of calamity. So how does the NDRRM Act build capacities in terms of disaster preparedness? So they can be utilized for pre-disaster preparedness program, um, by purchasing life-saving equipment, as we can see here, and then in terms of recovery, helping the local citizens, the local population through seed banks, okay, to accelerate their livelihood recovery. So, what happens when a disaster strikes, for example? So, a state of calamity can be declared so that disaster response can be coordinated. And again, who can declare that state of calamity? The president. Okay, so the president of the country, the local sanggunian, uh, can also declare and lift the state of calamity within their locality based on the recommendation to the local DRRMC council, okay, DRRM council. So what are the remedial measures? So these are the mandatory courses of action as soon as the state of calamity has been declared. So that includes imposition of price ceiling, so that the sellers cannot take advantage of the calamity. So there's no drastic increase in the prices of basic food, basic necessities. Prevention of overpricing and profiteering. I've just said that. Of hoarding, okay? Prevention of hoarding of medicines and petroleum products. Programming or reprogramming of funds for the repair and upgrading of public infrastructure, and granting of no interest loans. That's why we mentioned here seed banks, okay? Lending money to those who are mostly affected so that they could start their life anew. Okay, it's important also for emergency drills to be conducted at a regular basis and for the information to be disseminated among the citizens. Under the DRRM Act 2010, so these are the prohibitions and penalties. Number one will be the dereliction of duties or the abandonment of your post or negligence in your part, which leads to the destruction, loss of lives, critical damage of facilities, and misuse of funds. Okay, we've talked about this here. Okay. And then preventing the entry and distribution of relief goods in disaster-stricken areas, including appropriate technology, tools, equipment, accessories, disaster teams, and experts. Buying, buying for consumption or resale from disaster relief agencies of any relief goods or equipments which are intended for the disaster-affected communities. So that's prohibited. Misrepresenting the source of relief goods, equipment, and other aid commodities by covering or replacing the labels of the containers to make it appear that the goods, equipment, and other commodities came from other agencies or persons, and repacking the goods um, or other aids into containers with different markings. Okay, those are all prohibited. So you can check this out from Official Gazette. I'll provide the link in the description below. What are the penalties for committing those prohibited acts? So this includes a fine between 50,000 to 500,000 pesos, imprisonment between 6 months to 1 year, both fine and imprisonment, and confiscation of the objects and instruments used. For government officials, he or she shall be perpetually disqualified to run for office. Okay? In addition to the fine and imprisonment. For a corporation, partnership, or association, the penalty shall be imposed upon the officers of that corporation. Their licenses or accreditation shall also be cancelled or revoked, and for a foreigner, he or she can be deported after the service of the sentence. In conclusion, from this report from Commission on Audit, typhoons, landslides, and volcanic eruptions and earthquakes will continue to strike the Philippines. Okay, so the government and the general public have no other recourse, no other choice but to intensify their disaster prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. Then this is one I'm very passionate about. We've been talking about this all this semester. Climate change will only bring about more recurrent and fiercer calamities. That is why DRRM should be at the forefront of national and local development plans and policies. So these are important phone numbers in case of emergency. So I recommend that you take note of this or save this in your cell phone. So you could pause the video and write these numbers down. Now, if you're interested, you could also visit the local community's disaster preparedness. This one is actually a performance task from my grade 11 students for academic year 2019-2020. You can check this in the online library. Now, this one is from DepEd Teaching Guide for DRRM. So these are the recommendation in coming up with your own family survival kit. So they say that the first 72 hours after a disaster is critical. So because food, water, electricity, and communication may not be available. Therefore, a survival kit per family must also be present. Okay, that should let the family member survive for at least 3 days or 72 hours. So this includes food, water, blanket, tools for personal effects and hygiene kit, important family documents and money, and first aid kit, and then in detail these are the ones that we should take note. For water, a person 4 liters per person per day. Okay, or that's for 1 liter for drinking and 3 liters for sanitation. So 4 liters per person per day. So if you have, you just have to multiply that for the number of people in your home. For tools, this must include maps, whistle, flashlight, matches, list of emergency numbers, blankets, and sleeping bags. For food, store only non-perishable food such as canned goods, crackers and dried fruits, juice, and disposable plates and utensils. Important family documents and money must be kept in a plastic envelope. Money must be available in the form of cash or loose change since ATM machines may not be working, prepaid cards, birth certificates, passport, marriage contract, and all that. For personal effects and hygiene, extra clothing, undergarments, toothpaste, toothbrush, tissue paper, first aid kit, gloves, adhesive strips, thermometer, anti-diarrhea medication, pain reliever. For things that are good to have, pair of scissors, closed shoes, avoid salty or sugary food as they will make you more thirsty. Food cans open for more than 2 hours should not be consumed anymore. And opening the refrigerator constantly will spoil the food inside faster. So do not open it when the power is out. So I recommend that you also read this document. You can find this in the online library. That ends our video. I hope you learned something new. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like and share this video. Till next time, goodbye.